So before we begin like the official summarization of your article, I
Mhm.
would love to get a little bit of information about yourself. So kind of what, drives you to do the research that you do, or just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name is Archie Crowley. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an assistant professor in the English department at a school in North Carolina called Elon University, where I primarily teach undergrads about like linguistics and language and gender. And that's also what my research is on. I did my PhD at the University of South Carolina, and my work has been with trans and non-binary communities in the US South, thinking about how trans folks in the South are thinking about language and language specifically about gender in relationship to other social identities like Southernness, race, age, and all of those things. And I moved to the South after I finished my undergrad. I'm originally from Southern California,
Oh,
uh,
wow.
and got into linguistics and linguistic anthropology as an undergraduate student at UCLA. And then I moved after undergrad to Atlanta, where I was teaching adult ESL classes and thinking about going to graduate school, and also figuring out a lot of things about my own identity. And ended up going to South Carolina and really had never expected to stay in the South, and got really involved in trans communities in South Carolina. And that really shaped a lot of my research in working with trans communities in the South, and thinking about that through the lens of language, because trans people are always talking about language. And
Absolutely.
so that became really important to me. Yeah.
I think that's so cool when I was reading through your article and kind of you talk about a little bit about your own identity and experience. Like, I think it's so cool how that trajectory of like your own personal life can kind of shape your research interests and kind of the things that you pursue to do. I think it's really cool. Would you be able to give us a summary of the article that you had submitted to the JLA for a public audience?
Yeah, so this paper looks at moments from interviews with trans and non-binary folks in South Carolina, and how in these discussions about language, when these participants were talking about what we think of as linguistic appropriation, specifically when words get borrowed or taken from communities that they are not originally a part of. And in kind of popular discourse, um, people have become really aware of the process of linguistic appropriation, specifically from African American English. And especially in queer communities, there's a growing awareness of thinking about why might this be harmful, and how is it kind of reinscribing these hierarchies of like extractive processes of taking resources, language from one community and not recognizing where it comes from, using it in ways that don't kind of match how communities had used it historically. But what's interesting is that in these interviews, even when white participants were aware of this process or critical of it, they would often still refer to like these language features or practices coming from African American speech communities as slang. Um, and how when participants of color, particularly Black participants, were talking about white trans communities, they would often talk about the language as this sort of like standardizing force. Their experiences with white trans communities and language, they're often talking about it as like a gatekeeping process where white trans communities are specifically invested in creating like a taxonomy, like a list of like, these are the words and this is how we use it. And so I make this analysis that in some ways, despite the fact that communities are becoming more aware of the process of appropriation, that there is still this hierarchy that's being reinscribed in how people talk about it, so that um, Black language is still being associated with like cool slang, and white language is still being associated with a standardizing force. And that's really complicated because linguists have often thought that, like, if we just educate people about these processes and they're harmful, that like that will be a way to end some of these uh, systems of oppression, or like people will be more aware, and yet these things can still be reinscribed in new ways of talking about it.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. When I was reading it, there was one part where you talk about one participant who was like, oh, I think it was a white participant, was
Mhm.
really keenly aware. And I think they were talking about how they were like, I'm trying to remove all of the like slang
Mhm.
I've appropriated. And it's like, well, technically, you can't really do that. And so
Yeah.
even when there's awareness, it's not necessarily like, I don't know, there's still something missing. There's still a
Mhm.
piece that's like, we're getting there, but not quite.
Yeah, and I think the when the white participants talk about it, and obviously this is a small group of participants,
Of
this
course.
is not like making broad generalizations, but more a way of kind of exploring how these things emerge in conversation. The white participants were pointing to it as like how to avoid erasures from the past, and but then some of the Black participants were more like, what are the material impacts of these things? How does this kind of create a certain image of what transness is? And people, they're pointing towards different impacts. Even though they were both saying like, hey, these are impacts, they still understood them in different ways.
Absolutely. Well, it was really interesting for me to kind of read through and try to understand those different impacts of the participants, belonging to those
Mhm.
communities, how that could affect them in different ways. So thank you for writing such an interesting article. And before I let you go, would you be able to share with us any sort of social media that you have or like anywhere that people can like continue to follow your studies or your work?
Yeah, I am not very much on the internet, but I think the most public place would be on BlueSky. I'm just like at Archie Crowley, which is my name.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for meeting with the JLA. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we can keep following up on all your other works very soon here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.